but bestowing mercy down to the thousandth generation on the children of those who love me and keep my commandments. In today's reading from Exodus, we hear the Ten Commandments. One of the things we see in the extended couple of verses connected with the worship of other gods and idols is the statement that God is a jealous God who inflicts punishment on one's descendants down to the third or fourth generation. And taken out of context, this can seem a bit harsh. But in context, this statement of God's justice shows us a couple things. First of all, that the effect of one's sin is not just on oneself. Now, we constantly hear the reminder to instill one's faith into one's children. We particularly hear that later in the Pentateuch, in Deuteronomy. Just as the faith is passed on, so is the lack of faith. But we can also miss something else very important here if we pull this line out of context. We can miss our verse of the day, which tells us about God's mercy. You see, this line is meant to be juxtaposed with the statement of God's justice, where we hear that punishments go down to the third or fourth generation. But the statement on mercy is that God's mercy extends down to the thousandth generation. That's 250 times greater. The point of the passage is that while God is just, God's mercy is always larger and greater. Sometimes when we hear a passage like the Ten Commandments, we simply think of God as a detached lawgiver, simply issuing edicts that we must all follow. But God's mercy, which in this passage begins with the acceptance and worship of God, shows that God is not detached at all. Rather, God's very involved in our lives and wants to be so. But we also need to be open to God's presence in our lives. The moral rules we get from the church and that we see in Scripture are not meant to be restrictions or barriers to our relationship with God. Rather, they're meant to be the means of living that relationship out. So let us today set out with that goal in mind, and remembering that we have a God whose mercy is greater than we can imagine.